Imagine being just 19 years old, far away from home, dropped into the bloodiest war the world had ever seen. You think you're fighting for freedom, for honor. And then in a single moment, everything changes. You're captured, stripped of your name, your identity. And for the next 3 years, you live not as a soldier, not even as a man, but as a prisoner. This is the true story of one soldier's survival inside one of the most brutal POW camps of World War II. A story so raw, so human, that by the end you won't look at history the same way again. You know, it was the winter of 1942. The Eastern Front was a frozen hell. As Private Thomas Hale, just a farm boy from Iowa, had been deployed with his unit against German forces near the edges of Poland. Snow bit into his skin like knives. The battlefield was chaos. Machine guns rattled, mortars screamed, and men fell beside him like broken dolls. Thomas barely remembers the exact moment he was captured. 1 second, he was running through the smoke. The next, he felt the barrel of a rifle press into his back. Hands ripped away his weapon. A voice, harsh and guttural, barked in German, "Gefangen! Hände hoch! Prisoner, hands up!" That was it. His war was over, but in truth, his nightmare had just begun. The prisoners were marched for days, boots frozen stiff, lips cracked from thirst. By the time they reached Stalag 4B, one of Germany's largest POW camps, Thomas was half conscious. The camp loomed like something out of a nightmare. Barbed wire fences 3 layers thick, watchtowers with machine guns pointing down, dogs snarling at the perimeter. Prisoners shuffled around inside like ghosts, skin and bones, eyes hollow. At the gate, German guards lined the men up, shouting orders. Each prisoner was searched, stripped of personal belongings. Thomas's last photograph of his family, his mother and younger sister, was torn from his pocket and tossed aside into the mud. He bent down to grab it, but the butt of a rifle struck his ribs, dropping him to the ground. For the first time, Thomas realized, I might never see home again. Life in the camp was survival stripped to its ugliest form. Prisoners woke up at dawn to the shrill whistle of guards. Breakfast? A watery soup with a single potato floating in it, if they were lucky. Lunch? Stale bread, often moldy. Dinner? Another thin broth that barely touched the hunger clawing inside. The cold was unrelenting. Thin uniforms offered no protection. Men wrapped themselves in whatever scraps they could find. Dirty blankets, burlap sacks, even straw stuffed into shirts. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, sometimes whole limbs, and the guards, many treated the prisoners as less than animals. They laughed as they forced sick men to shovel snow for hours. They beat anyone who stumbled in line. Sometimes, without warning, they dragged a man away, and he never came back. But Thomas refused to give up. He told himself, if I surrender inside, I die. If I hold on, I might see home again. He found small ways to survive. He traded what little bread he had for scraps of clothing. He whispered prayers at night, remembering his family farm, the warm smell of bread in his mother's kitchen, the sound of his sister laughing. He made friends, men from Britain, Canada, Australia, soldiers who became his brothers. Together they shared every crumb, every stolen moment of hope. Thomas also learned to read the guards. Some were merciless, but others, tired, broken, just following orders. One young guard, barely older than Thomas, sometimes looked away when prisoners stole wood for fires. No. Even in hell, humanity flickered. Life in the camp wasn't just about survival. It was about dignity, about fighting back in the only ways they could. Some prisoners dug tunnels, though most collapsed before reaching the wire. Others smuggled news, passing along scraps of paper that told of Allied victories. When men heard that the tide of war was turning, cheers erupted in whispers across the barracks. Thomas joined a group who risked their lives to keep a hidden journal. On scraps of paper they wrote names, dates, little pieces of their lives. So if we die, one British soldier said, someone someday will know we were here. By the end of his first year, Thomas was down to ebad arsis pounds. His cheekbones jutted like knives. He could feel every rib beneath his skin. He saw men waste away, one by one, and it terrified him. Oh? One night, as snow slammed against the barracks roof, Thomas nearly gave in. He curled in the corner, shaking, whispering, "I can't do this anymore." His breath fogged in the freezing air. Then he pulled out a tiny scrap of cloth he had hidden since capture. A piece torn from his family photo. His sister's smile, half ripped but still there. He stared at it until morning. That little face kept him alive. Days bled into months, months into years, 3 full years inside those barbed wires. But Thomas adapted. He became cunning, patient. He learned which guards were cruel, which ones might slip him an extra crust of bread. He learned how to ration his hunger, how to make one potato last 3 days. He learned how to keep hope burning, even when everything else had been stripped away. He survived by remembering who he was not as a prisoner, but as a son, a brother, a human being. 3 years in hell. 3 years of cold, hunger, and fear. Yet Thomas Hale survived. But survival had a cost. And what happened next would change him forever. Because one day in the spring of 1945, the gates of the camp finally opened. And what Thomas saw then was almost harder to believe than the years he had endured. Inside. The nights inside the camp were colder than any winter Wilhelm had ever known, even though he came from a land where snow covered rooftops and winds lashed bare branches. The difference was not the temperature, but the weight of hopelessness that made every gust feel like ice against the soul. The POW camp was not just barbed wire and wooden towers. It was a machine built to grind men down slowly, to erase their strength, and leave behind only obedience. The guards had no need for constant violence. Starvation did most of their work. A single bowl of thin soup, a piece of bread that could vanish in 2 bites. That was meant to sustain grown men, forced into hours of labor. Wilhelm often thought of the meals back home, of potatoes fried in butter, of his mother's bread that filled the whole street with its smell. But in camp, memory was dangerous. The more you remembered, the harder it was to endure the present. And yet, he could not stop himself. Each night, lying on the cold wooden boards of the barracks, he closed his eyes and saw his village, saw his wife Anna, and his little boy Carl. He had last seen Carl when he was only 2 years old. Would Carl even remember his father if he never returned? That thought haunted him more than the guard's boots or the hunger in his belly. Survival in camp was not about strength of muscle but strength of spirit. Some men gave up early, you could see it in their eyes. The way they stopped standing straight, the way they accepted every order without a flicker of resistance. They had already surrendered inside. Wilhelm refused to let that happen. He whispered to himself every morning, 3 things. Breathe, endure, and return. That became his prayer, his routine. The guards sometimes allowed mail, but it was censored. Words scratched out until the letters looked like ghosts. Once, Wilhelm received a note from Anna. It had only 1 sentence left untouched. "Carl asks when you are coming home." That piece of paper, folded and hidden beneath his shirt, became his shield. Whenever the camp seemed unbearable, he touched it to remind himself that the world outside still existed, that his family still waited. Disease spread faster than whispers in camp. Dysentery, lice, fever. It seemed every week another man disappeared from the bunks, carried out by 2 others who were barely strong enough to drag the body. Wilhelm watched his friend Emil waste away. Emil had been strong once, a man who joked even when beaten, but hunger stole his laughter and fever stole his life. Wilhelm sat beside him on the final night, holding his hand, because Emil was too weak to speak. When the breath finally left Emil's chest, Wilhelm made a silent vow. He would live. Not just for himself, but for those who could not. He would carry their memory beyond these fences. The brutality of the camp was not always loud. Sometimes it was silence that broke men, the silence of unanswered questions. How long would the war last? Would the Allies ever know of their suffering? Were they forgotten? To crush that silence, Wilhelm and a few others began telling stories at night. They spoke of their villages, of family meals, of fishing trips, of children's laughter. The stories were not just escape, they were rebellion. By remembering life, they refused to let the camp reduce them to nameless bodies. One evening, after a particularly brutal day of forced labor, repairing roads under freezing rain, Wilhelm stumbled back into the barracks, half-conscious. His body trembled uncontrollably. A guard had struck him across the back earlier for slowing down, and he could feel the swelling. He thought he might not last the night. But then one of the older prisoners, a quiet man named Franz, tore a piece of his own blanket and wrapped it around Wilhelm's shoulders. "You must survive," Franz whispered, "not for yourself, for truth. When this war ends, the world must hear what happened here." Those words carved themselves into Wilhelm's heart. He knew then his survival was no longer only for Anna and Karl, but for history. Over the months, the prisoners developed a system of small resistances. They passed food crumbs to the weakest men. They scratched secret marks on the walls to count the days. They shared rumors, sometimes false, sometimes true, about Allied advances. Each rumor was like a flame, and even if it was just smoke, it kept them warm against despair. But the guards knew how to crush hope. One winter morning, they dragged 3 prisoners to the yard. The men had been caught, trying to steal extra bread from the kitchen. The entire camp was forced to watch, as the guards beat them mercilessly. One of them was only 18, a boy who barely had a beard. Wilhelm forced himself not to look away, but in his heart he screamed. He thought of Karl, and he swore his son would never see him broken like that. No, 3 years inside the camp felt like 30. Days blurred into nights, winters into summers. The seasons changed, but the misery remained constant. What shocked Wilhelm most was how the human body could adapt to nearly anything. Hunger became normal. Pain became routine. Fear became background noise. The real danger was forgetting you were human at all. To fight that, Wilhelm began carving small wooden figures from scraps he found during labor. A bird, a horse, a tiny soldier. He gave them to others in the barracks, and for a moment, men who had lost everything held something made just for them. It was not much, but it reminded them they were still men capable of creation, not just survival. The end of the 3rd year brought whispers of change. Guards grew nervous. Their commands were sharper, their eyes restless. Something was shifting in the outside world. The prisoners didn't know exactly what, but Wilhelm felt it in his bones. The war was turning, and if the war was turning, so was fate. One evening, as Wilhelm sat with his back against the wooden wall, he pressed Anna's letter to his chest and closed his eyes. He whispered his vow again: breathe, endure, return. He knew he had survived what many could not, but survival was not enough. Now he had to find a way home. The morning that changed everything began like any other. The prisoners rose at the crack of dawn, their bodies stiff, their stomachs already growling with hunger. The guards barked orders, boots striking the frozen ground. But something in the air felt different. The guards looked uneasy, whispering among themselves instead of standing tall with their usual cruelty. The silence that followed those whispers was heavier than any beating. Wilhelm sensed it immediately. After 3 years in the camp, he had learned to read fear, not just in fellow prisoners, but in their captors as well. And now, for the first time, he saw real fear in the guards' eyes. That morning, when they lined the men up for roll call, the shouting was sharp, but their hands trembled. Even a prisoner could tell the war was slipping from their grasp. For days, the tension grew. Guards argued with each other. Some disappeared entirely, never returning to the towers. The food rations became even smaller, the punishments harsher, as if cruelty could mask their desperation. But underneath, everyone in camp knew something was happening outside these walls. The world beyond the barbed wire was moving closer. Then, one night, the thunder of artillery rolled through the distance. At first, The prisoners thought it was just another nightmare echoing in their minds. But then came another blast, louder, closer. Men sat up on their bunks, eyes wide. For years they had dreamed of this sound. The sound of not light, battle that did not involve them directly, but might change everything. Whispers ran through the barracks, the Allies, they're near. The guards' behavior confirmed it. They shouted orders more frantically, dragging prisoners to work on fortifications outside the camp, forcing them to dig trenches in frozen soil. But even as Wilhelm's hands bled against the shovel, he felt something new stir inside him. Hope was no longer a fragile dream. It was a fire. One afternoon, while returning from labor, Wilhelm saw something extraordinary. A guard, one of the younger ones, barely more than a boy, was crying. Tears streamed down his face as he clutched a letter. The man collapsed onto the steps of the watchtower, his rifle forgotten at his side. Wilhelm stared, stunned. It was the first time he had ever seen a guard crack. In that moment he realized the machine of cruelty was breaking apart. The war outside was finally reaching inside these fences. The final days of the camp blurred into chaos. Guards fled in the night, abandoning posts. Some stayed, more brutal than ever, lashing out to prove their strength as everything else slipped away. But they could not control the tide. On a cold gray morning, Wilhelm woke to an eerie silence. No boots, no shouted orders, no guards at the door. The camp was still. At first, no one dared move. Then slowly men crept outside. The towers were empty. The gate stood open. Beyond the barbed wire, smoke rose in the distance, but no soldiers blocked the way. The guards had vanished. The prisoners stood frozen. For years, they had dreamed of freedom. But when it finally came, they did not know how to step into it. The gate looked less like salvation and more like a mirage. It was Wilhelm who moved first. He touched the open gate, the rust cold against his fingers, and pushed it wider. "It's real," he whispered. His voice cracked. "It's real." Men stumbled forward, some running, some too weak to do more than crawl. Tears streaked their hollow faces. Others fell to their knees, pressing their lips to the ground outside the fence, as if kissing holy earth. Wilhelm stood among them, dizzy with disbelief. He pressed Anna's letter to his heart and closed his eyes. For the first time in 3 years, the air tasted like freedom. But freedom did not mean safety. The war was still raging, and the countryside beyond was torn apart by conflict. The prisoners had no food, no strength, and no clear path. Some wanted to scatter, to flee in different directions. Others insisted they should stay together. Wilhelm knew one thing: he had to find his way home no matter what. The days that followed were a test of endurance even harsher than the camp. The men walked through forests and across fields, surviving on roots, snow, and the rare kindness of villagers who dared to give them bread. Many still wore the striped rags of the camp, marks of suffering that made them both pitied and feared. One night, Wilhelm collapsed in a barn after walking 30 miles. His body shook with fever. He thought of Emil, of Franz, of all those who had not made it out alive. He thought he might join them that night. But then he heard a voice, gentle, steady. An old woman who had given them shelter placed a hand on his forehead and whispered, "Hold on. You've come too far to let go now." She gave him broth, warm and salty, and for the first time in years, real nourishment spread through his body. The journey stretched into weeks. At last, ragged and broken, Wilhelm reached the outskirts of his village. He stood on a hill, staring down at the rooftops. He had carried in his mind through every nightmare. Smoke curled from chimneys. Children's laughter floated faintly on the wind. It was as if the world he had lost still waited, unchanged. But as he walked down the road, his legs trembling, his heart pounded with fear. What if Anna had given up? What if Karl no longer remembered him? What if his home had moved on without him? He nearly turned back, but then he thought of the vow he had whispered every morning. Breathe, endure, return. It was time to fulfill it. The door to his house was the same weathered wood he had remembered. His hand shook as he lifted it to knock. Before he could, the door opened. Anna stood there, a basket in her arms. For a heartbeat, she did not recognize the gaunt man before her. But then her eyes widened, her breath caught, and the basket fell to the floor. "Wilhelm?" she whispered. He could not answer. His throat closed. But when Karl appeared behind her, older now, taller, his eyes wide with shock, Wilhelm fell to his knees. He gathered them both in his arms, and for the first time in years, he let himself weep freely. The war had taken nearly everything. His strength, his friends, his youth. But it had not taken his soul. He had survived 3 years in a brutal camp. Not because he was stronger than others, but because he never stopped believing that one day he would stand on his own doorstep again. And now, with Anna's arms around him and Karl's small hand clutching his, he knew the vow was complete. He had returned. Life after the camp was not the happy ending Wilhelm once imagined. Freedom came with its own scars, ones that did not fade when the gates of the prison swung open. He was home, yes. He was with Anna and Karl, yes. But the man who had stepped into their doorway was not the same man who had left 3 years before. The first nights back were the hardest. He lay in his own bed, the mattress soft beneath his bones. The quilt Anna had sewn years ago heavy on his chest, but his eyes would not close. In the darkness he heard footsteps, the slam of a rifle butt against a door, the harsh bark of German commands. His body jolted awake at every creak of the house, sweat soaking his skin. More than once, Anna woke to find him standing by the window, eyes scanning the horizon like a guard searching for escapees. The war had trained his body to expect cruelty, and now even in peace it lingered like a shadow. During the day Karl followed him closely, as if afraid his father might vanish again. The boy asked questions Wilhelm struggled to answer. Did you fight battles? Did you win? Did you see heroes? Wilhelm wanted to give him stories of glory, tales that would make his son proud. But the truth was different. There were no heroes in the camp, only survivors and ghosts. Anna noticed it too. She touched his face with tenderness. But in her eyes he saw the worry she tried to hide. She had waited for him, prayed for him, kept his memory alive. But now that he had returned, she saw a stranger in her husband's place. Wilhelm loved her more fiercely than ever. But sometimes when he looked at her, his heart ached with guilt. For 3 years, she had carried the weight of their lives alone. And though he had survived, part of him wondered if he had truly come back at all. Weeks turned into months. The war ended. Villages rebuilt. Flags changed. People began to speak of peace, of a brighter future. But Wilhelm remained trapped in the camp, even as he walked free. He could not eat a meal without remembering the taste of watery soup. He could not hear laughter without thinking of the silence after a meal's last breath. He carried the faces of men who never left those barracks, and they haunted him in quiet moments. One evening, Anna found him in the barn, his hands gripping the wooden beam, as tears rolled silently down his cheeks. "I made it home," he whispered, "but why them, not me? Why Franz? Why Emil? Why not me?" His voice broke. Anna held him, her own tears falling. "Because you were meant to come back," she told him softly. "Not just for me, not just for Karl, but so their stories would not die in that camp." Her words struck something deep within him. That night, Wilhelm lit a candle and opened a notebook. He began to write. At first, the words were halting, broken, just fragments of memory, the cold of the barracks, the sound of boots on gravel, Emil's trembling hands, Franz's laughter on the day they smuggled potatoes. Slowly, the fragments became stories. Every evening, after work in the fields, Wilhelm returned to that notebook. He poured out every detail, every moment, every name. He wrote not just for himself, but for the men who could not. His pen scratched across the paper long into the night, as Anna sat beside him, mending clothes by the fire. Karl would sometimes sneak in, reading the pages when his father wasn't looking. His young eyes widened with horror and awe. One night he asked, "Papa, why do you write the sad parts too? Why not just the ending, when you came home?" Wilhelm looked at him and said, "Because the world must know the truth, not just the ending." If we forget the suffering, then nothing changes. Years passed. Wilhelm's hair turned gray. His son grew into a man. The scars of the camp remained, but the act of writing gave Wilhelm a kind of peace he had once thought impossible. His notebooks filled shelf after shelf, until they became a chronicle of not just one man's survival, but of all those who had walked behind barbed wire. One spring, a historian visited the village, collecting accounts of the war. When he learned of Wilhelm's story, he asked to see the notebooks. Wilhelm hesitated at first. They were pieces of his soul, his blood spilled in ink. But Anna reminded him of his vow, to carry the memories of those who could not. So he handed them over. Months later, letters arrived. People across Germany, across Europe read his words. Some wept, some raged, some were silent, shaken. Wilhelm received visitors who thanked him, who told him they finally understood what their fathers or brothers had endured. He realized his suffering had not been meaningless. His survival had become a voice for the voiceless. Still, even with recognition, the nightmares never fully left. He carried them until his final days. But he also carried something else. An unshakable truth, that even in the darkest, most brutal places, the human spirit can endure. That love can survive hunger, cruelty, despair. That one man's refusal to break can keep hope alive for countless others. On his last night, as he lay surrounded by family, Wilhelm asked Karl to promise him something. "Do not let the world forget," he whispered. "Tell them what happened. Tell them what we lived through." Karl nodded, his eyes wet with tears. "I will, Papa. I swear it." Rikano stemper perste foret some verfraching abs tumpres of Freier's eyes. And when Wilhelm finally closed his eyes, he did so with the peace of a man who had carried his vow to the very end. He had endured, he had returned, and he had spoken for the fallen. The years after Wilhelm's passing were quiet in the village, but his story did not fade. Karl kept his father's notebooks carefully bound, the ink still dark, the pages carrying the weight of memory. Sometimes he would take them out late at night, reading by candlelight. His father's voice seemed to echo from those lines, as if Wilhelm himself sat beside him, retelling every detail of the camp, every moment of pain and endurance. Karl had sworn to his father that the world would not forget, and he carried that vow like a second heartbeat. But life had its own demands. He married, had children, worked the fields, and tried to rebuild the life the war had nearly stolen from his family. Yet in the quiet hours, he knew the notebooks were more than paper. They were truth. They were a warning. And they were a promise. As the decades passed, the world around Karl began to change. Germany rebuilt itself, cities rose from the ashes, and people began to speak less and less about the war. Younger generations wanted to forget, to bury the memories in favor of progress and hope. But Karl felt the danger in forgetting. He knew that if the stories of the camps were left to fade, then one day, someone might deny they ever happened. One autumn evening, Karl gathered his children around the table. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the walls. He placed one of Wilhelm's notebooks on the table and opened it carefully. His children leaned forward, their young faces curious. "This," Karl said softly, "is your grandfather's voice. These are the words he wrote when he came back to us. He wanted you to know. He wanted everyone to know. So tonight I will read to you what he endured." And he did. Page after page, his voice sometimes breaking, sometimes trembling with anger, sometimes barely above a whisper. His children sat silent, wide-eyed, tears forming as they listened to the story of a man they had never met, but who lived in every line of ink. No. When he finished, the room was quiet. Then his eldest daughter whispered, "Papa, why did he write all of this down, if it hurts so much?" Karl closed the notebook gently and looked at her. "Because memory is heavier than silence," he said, "and because truth, no matter how painful, is what keeps us human." Word of the notebooks spread slowly. A teacher in the nearby town asked to borrow them for her students. A local newspaper printed excerpts. Soon, people from beyond the village came to Karl's door, asking to see them. Survivors who had been in other camps came too. Some wept as they read Wilhelm's words. Some added their own stories, scribbled in the margins of his notebooks. The collection grew, not just Wilhelm's voice now, but a chorus of the forgotten. One winter, a historian from America arrived. He had read about the notebooks in a small European journal and traveled across the ocean to see them. Sitting at Karl's table, he carefully turned each page, his eyes wide with reverence. When he finished, he placed his hand on the cover and said, "These must not stay hidden. The world needs to hear this." Karl hesitated. These notebooks were sacred, pieces of his father's very soul. But then he remembered Wilhelm's last words, the vow to make sure the world never forgot. With trembling hands, he agreed. The historian arranged for the notebooks to be published. When the first copies came off the press, Karl held one in his hands, his father's name on the cover. He traced the letters with his fingers, whispering, "You are still speaking, Papa. You know?" The book traveled farther than Karl ever could have imagined. It was read in schools, in universities, in homes across Europe and America. Veterans wrote letters to Karl, telling him they finally found their own suffering reflected in Wilhelm's words. Families of the fallen wrote, saying they felt their loved one's memory honored through his story. But with recognition came resistance. There were those who denied, those who twisted history, those who claimed the camps were exaggerated. When Karl heard such voices, his heart burned with anger. He would stand before anyone holding the notebooks high and declare, "These are not lies. These are not stories made for comfort. These are the scars of truth, carved into every line." As the years wore on, Karl grew old. His children had children of their own, and the world seemed to move faster each day. But in his home, the notebooks remained, their presence a constant reminder of the vow he had carried all his life. On his last birthday, surrounded by family, Karl placed the notebooks in the hands of his eldest son. "These are yours now," he said. "Promise me you will keep the vow. Promise me you will never let them be forgotten." His son nodded, tears in his eyes. "I promise, Papa." That night, Karl closed his eyes for the last time, and though grief filled the house, his family knew his soul had finally joined Wilhelm's, both men bound forever, by memory and endurance. Decades later, long after Karl was gone, the notebooks sat in a museum, their pages carefully preserved. Visitors walked past the glass case, reading the words that Wilhelm had once scratched into paper by candlelight. Some wept. Some stood in silence, unable to move. Some brought their children, pointing to the notebooks and saying, "Remember, this is what happened. This is what we must never allow again." In that way, Wilhelm's vow lived on, not just in his family but in strangers across the world. His survival was more than his own victory. It became a warning, a testament, and a light that refused to die, even in the darkest of human history. And so, the man who had once stumbled out of a brutal camp, gaunt and broken, had left behind something greater than freedom. He had left behind truth, and through truth he ensured that even in death, he would never be silenced. Time has a way of carrying stories across generations, like a river that never stops flowing. Decades passed since Wilhelm first wrote his memories in those fragile notebooks, and yet his words continued to echo. His great-grandchildren, now growing up in a world without barbed wire fences or guard towers, still felt the weight of his survival. In schools they studied the Second World War as history, distant and almost unreal. But when they visited the museum where Wilhelm's notebooks were displayed, it became personal. Behind the glass they saw the shaky handwriting, the uneven lines, the pages worn by his trembling hands. And suddenly the war was not just a chapter in a textbook. It was their blood, their name, their legacy. One of his great-granddaughters, a young woman with curious eyes, pressed her hand against the glass. She whispered, "You lived so we could be free." The words were simple, but in that quiet moment she felt her ancestors' presence. It was as if Wilhelm was still there, standing beside her, reminding her to never forget. The family carried his memory into the future, retelling his story at gatherings, teaching the younger ones that freedom had been bought at a terrible price. They understood that remembering was not just a duty, but an act of love. Every time they opened his notebooks, they brought his voice back to life, ensuring it would never fade into silence. But Wilhelm's legacy went beyond his family. Strangers who read his story found courage in their own struggles. Survivors of other wars, other prisons, other tragedies, found strength in his vow to endure. Teachers used his words to remind students of what hate can do, and why it must never be allowed to return. His story, once scribbled in secret by candlelight, became a beacon for countless souls who needed hope. And that is the true power of survival. Not just to live, but to give meaning to life after suffering. Wilhelm had returned broken, but he left behind something unbreakable, a truth that could not be buried, denied, or erased. Now, as we look back on his journey, we are reminded of the question he carried. Why him? Why not the others? Perhaps the answer lies here, in the way his story continues to move us. Decades after the barbed wire fell, his survival was not only for himself, or even for his family, but for all of us who need to remember what humanity can endure and overcome. So when you hear his story, when you think of that gaunt man clutching a letter in the cold of a prison camp, remember that his words still live, because we choose to carry them. As long as we tell his story, he is not gone, And if you believe stories like these should never be forgotten, if you want to honor the voices of the past and keep them alive for the future, then join us here, subscribe to our channel, so together we can keep telling the stories that must be remembered, because some voices should never fade into silence.